the couple ring mark. We did try to do it, we postponed it. Hibernation and Laura sussed out, she said there was no over trees. We'll wait till vegetation down and we'll have a year. Okay, so, you, Kenny?
Maybe a little bit. There's one by. Good evening. Great to be. This is the first I've ever been to Cumnock other than passing through, so it's nice to new town in Scotland. So, I think I was going to Ballochmyle. So this evening about a local historic rock site, which is actually I think one of the most impressive sites of this time in Western Europe, but a site that's actually quite little known, really, surprisingly little even by archaeologists. As also not the easiest site to get into either, despite it's not that far away from the main road. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the site of Ballochmyle and contextualise that with what we know about this type of site, which will be how unusual Ballochmyle is. And then I want to finish by just giving an example of archaeology I've been working in Ayrshire with what an exciting local rock art site do, kind of bit of engagement involved. I gave the person this talk, Catrine, is that how you pronounce it? I was told off for pronouncing it one night. About months ago, and they're slightly closer to Ballochmyle, quite keen to think about doing something, maybe get down and things to the site. So I'll talk a bit about my experience of a difference. I've done a lot of that. The site itself, which is spectacular, is the International Atlas Obscura of strange and unusual visitor attraction. Tapestry of Neolithic Bronze Age. This photo, what the site is. You've got a series of vertical sandstone cliff faces, which have got covered in dozens and dozens of these circular shapes, as an assortment of other wonderful carvings as well. Essentially, this is a site because of the carvings, so there's a huge amount of activity for here on this in prehistory. Back to the details of that as we go along. But its location on a vertical cliff is incredibly rare. There's almost no parallels for this thing called, and so that alone sets out as this out as being an unusual site. It's also in an area there's of these types of almost no others. So it stands out as a really significant site with a tradition that didn't otherwise seem to really be part of the fierce scene in this part of Scotland. Interesting things going on here that I'll try and kind of talk about during my talk this evening. So to contextualise this a bit, it's worth just reflecting on this type of archaeology site and what we know about these archaeologically. So in the last 20 years, these circular, these abstract symbols have become gradually known as a rock art tradition, and that's because you've similar types of carvings broad areas of northwestern Europe, and I'll show a map of that in a wee while. And so they've gradually become sites and feature archaeologists taking serious nothing. Really until the 90s, most prehistoric archaeologists didn't really have much interest in cup and ring marks, abstract rock. Almost all of the fantastic being done with these sites was being done by amateur archaeologists who all the hard work and all of the recording. People like in Scotland, who's a picking thing studies, who was actually a solicitor from Glasgow, who did most of it in his spare time until he retired, and Stan, who's based in the north of England, who huge amounts of looking at the rock art sites of Britain and Ireland. So archaeologists didn't really take rock seriously. I think it was so difficult to understand, and it sort of became the remit of one professional archaeologist to look at, and archaeologists didn't really try and integrate them in broader narratives of what we knew about life in the Neolithic and Bronze Age. Very disappointing that gradually started to change in the 1990s, including with archaeologists starting to excavate around rock art sites and having a better understanding of these sites and trying to understand how they fitted into broader prehistoric lifeways. Although even then, many archaeologists still don't really discuss this type of rock art as an important part of the lives of people who lived thousands of years ago. If you read main textbooks on Neolithic and Bronze Age Britain, rock art will probably get a paragraph or something like that, despite the fact that these are really spectacular sites. And it says here there's over 3,000 sites in Scotland alone where someone decided 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago to carve these symbols into a rock for whatever reason. So there's a lot of these sites, and that's just the ones in Scotland. So the most prominent markings, the most commonly ones that we see, are known as cups and cup and ring marks. And so these are very simple symbols. The cups are literally just circular hollows, usually maybe up to 2 inches in diameter, an inch deep, and these are carved into usually soft sandstone type rocks or sedimentary rocks. And the rings are just circles that are carved around the cups. So they're really very basic symbols, but they're also universal. As I said, we find these all over the place in northwestern Europe. Some of them have got lines running out from the centre, and those are known as gutters. So there's a kind of vocabulary has emerged over the last 200 years to understand the different shapes and forms, these motifs that were commonly carved. And the cup and ring marks in particular are very variable. You can go from anything up to 1 or 2 rings up to 8, 9 or 10. And some of them are really massive, maybe up to almost a metre in diameter. Most of them are a bit more modest in size than that. And the history of these names being used probably for these features probably goes back quite a long way. The site I've been working on in Dunbartonshire is known as the Cochno stone. And Cochno is derived from the Gaelic word for little cups. And we know that place name has been evident in documents going back to at least about the 11th or 12th century. So for almost 1,000 years, people in Scotland have been calling these cup marks or a Gaelic variation on that. So these are very long-lived names for these features, but it's very unlikely that they were known as cup and ring marks in prehistoric societies, and we've no idea what language people spoke back then anyway, so we've no idea what they would have called or how they would have characterized them. But the modern naming of these actually goes back quite a long way. So here's just some other examples of different sites. One of the places in Scotland that's got the biggest concentration of cup and ring marks is Kilmartin Glen. And so these are examples, and these also are just indicating some of the different ways these types of sites are recorded by archaeologists. So there are still lots of traditional drawings that are done, which are kind of scale measured drawings, either using rubbings from the site itself or scale photographs, or actually just tracing off images, digitally recorded images. There we also have laser scans and laser surveys of sites, which produce the image on the top right there, which is a black and white set of digital data, which you can then use to highlight different light directions and look at detail that isn't necessarily visible on photographs. And then you can also, as at the bottom right, it is not an animation, but you can make them into 3D models as well. And Scotland's Rock Art Project, which did a lot of work, and I'll come back to that in a minute or two, I've done a lot of work in the last 5 years on all of the sites in Scotland, and that included them doing 3D models of most of the sites in Scotland. And their website's got different models you can play about with and look at in 3 dimensions. Although, curiously, they didn't record Ballochmyle because it's such a well-recorded site, they didn't have to do any more additional recording on the site. So, but all of these sites have got all of these cup and ring marks, and also there are variations on that as well, unusual shapes, lines running in different directions. And also it's worth noting that quite often these sites have got quite a complex underlying natural set of patterns on the rocks as well. So this site in the top left here has got lots of cracks and veins and so on, some of which are interlink and intermingle with the symbols themselves. So it's likely that when the carvings were being done, that they were using the fabric of the rock itself to try and maybe augment natural cracks, to connect up different veins and lines, and that there was a bit of an interplay with the surface of the rock itself. There are all sorts of other motifs that are much less commonly occurring, but they're still nonetheless found across large areas of Britain and Ireland. Some of these are they look as if the old-fashioned dials of telephones. There's ones that are almost square or look a bit like strawberries. And there's ones that look like keyholes. There's occasional spirals, although that's more associated with passageway art traditions. And you also get sites where there's just lots and lots of cut marks that are all just kind of concentrated together, almost like a sort of frenzy of carving. So you get all these different forms and shapes that appear as well. And some of these are quite distinctive. This is a site on Arran, one of the few rock art sites in the island of Arran. It's Stonic Woods, which is near Brodick. And it's got this really strange set of carvings that almost look like figures, with sort of with cup and ring marks of double gutters running down from them. And all of them follow the kind of the vertical, the slope of the stone, and run parallel, or they run along in harmony with the cracks and symbols on that and the natural parts of that rock as well. So there's all sorts of different variations, but the cup and ring marks are the dominant form that we see in most of these sites. There are very occasional non-abstract symbols as well. This is much more common in places like Norway and Sweden, where you get lots of prehistoric carvings of things like boats and elk and people and ploughs and animals, fish and whales and so on. But when it comes to Scotland, these types of figurative bits of rock art are incredibly rare. There are almost no examples at all. In fact, one of them was only discovered during the pandemic, when someone must have got bored and went into a kist in Kilmartin Glen with a torch and at Duncre Craig, and found a series of carvings of red deer on the underside of the kist slab, which are incredibly difficult to see if you go to the site just now. But thankfully, someone's done a laser scan of those on the left-hand image there. And though this is very likely to have been carved probably in the Neolithic period, the last part of the Stone Age. So this is not hunter-gatherers; these are farmers who are depicting animals that would have still been hunted when they were farming. And then we've also got a few unusual sites that have got footprints. The Cocknow Stone, where I've been working in Dumbartonshire, has got two rather weird four-toed footprints, which may or may not be more recent additions to the rock face. The carvings of these certainly were recorded in the 1880s or 1890s, but we've no idea whether these are genuine prehistoric carvings or not. There are no other examples of four-toed footprints anywhere in Britain, but there are quite a lot of carvings of feet with 5 toes that you find, for instance, a site called the Calderstones in Liverpool, which has got an amazing collection of feet carvings. But these are generally quite rare. Most of the symbols are these abstract cup and ring marks. And that's why Ballochmyle is important, because it's potentially got red deer carvings as well, which are very rare. So these carvings are found in a whole different range of contexts. Sometimes they're just on natural outcrops of boulders, and there's lots and lots of examples of that. Sometimes they're on bedrock that's exposed. Sometimes we find them on monuments. So there's some really fine examples in Kilmartin of standing stones with cut marks on them, and also kist slabs as well. It's very likely these are secondary reuses of carved stones, because it probably was more difficult to carve a cut mark on a standing stone when the stone was standing than when it was on the ground as part of an outcrop of bedrock. So it may well be that they were reusing carved stones to make into standing stones and other features in the Bronze Age. There's a few examples of portable rock art where you get boulders that could have been theoretically moved around, or heavy rocks that have had symbols carved onto them. And there's quite a lot of those in the collections in Glasgow museums. And there are also other examples of vertical faces. For instance, Cobb Cow is a site in the Lake District, where the carvings have been made on the side of a massive glacial erratic. And those carvings are a bit of parallel to an extent to Ballochmyle, but they don't have the same density of symbols and variation of symbols. So these occur in all sorts of different contexts, but they're always carved into stone. And I think it's slightly strange is that we haven't ever found these symbols on any other aspect of human material culture. So none of these symbols are found on pottery, and we have very richly decorated pottery from the same periods, but we don't find any cup and ring marks on those. Textiles and organics don't tend to survive from this period, so if they had them on their clothing, we wouldn't necessarily ever find that in the archaeological record. People may have been tattooing themselves with these symbols, but again, the evidence for tattoos from this period in Britain is virtually nil. We do have tattoos from the Bronze Age in continental Europe, but they tend to just be lines and not these more complex symbols. So it may well be that these cup and ring mark type abstract motifs were only appropriate to be carved on rocks in outdoor locations, and was the context where these symbols worked, but they weren't part of any other part of society or social life, which is potentially quite an interesting observation, maybe not. So here's some maps. There's a lot of guesswork about this, incidentally, so as you always get with prehistory. So here's some maps. So this, the map on the left was produced by Scotland's Rock Art Project, and it shows essentially the darkest green colours are where you've got the biggest concentrations of cup and ring marks. And so you can see Argyll into Perth and Kinross in Scotland is a particularly busy area. Dumfries and Galloway, and then you've got the north of England and the Midlands. Then there's some patchy coverage elsewhere. The light greeny grey colour, there is rock art recorded, but it's not necessarily in much quantities. And you'll notice that where we are just now is not a dark green area, it's one of these light green areas. So rock art has been recorded here, but it's incredibly rare. And so there are very, very few sites in this area. And the map on the right, produced by Clive Waddington, shows outcrops and patches of these types of symbols occurring in other parts of northwestern and Atlantic fringe of Europe. So you get these types of symbols occurring in Spain, France, Ireland, and also, curiously not in Clive's map, but also in the Nordic countries as well. I was in Oslo for a couple of months last year working a research project, and one of my days off I went up to look at some cut marks in a park near the city centre, and these were on a caravan site. So we've got a rock here. It's not exactly the most spectacular archaeological site that you'll ever see, but there are some cut marks in the middle of it, and there's another site there that's more of a presented to the public with a lot of cut marks. So in Norway, these symbols are found as well, and they are generally regarded as being carved in maybe the Bronze Age or the Iron Age. The rock art in Norway with elk and with boats and animals is all really hunter-gatherer Mesolithic, which is much, much earlier. I'll show a timeline for these dates in a few minutes. In fact, the next slide. So the chronology is a big question. It's a big problem because we can't directly date any of these features. We still don't have the technology to actually date the carvings of these stones. I'm not saying that might not be possible one day, but so far no one's come up with a way to do it. And so all we really have are a few other bits of circumstantial evidence. So we can look at the associations that these features, these carvings have with, for instance, monuments where they're used. So if we have a standing stone that was erected in 2000 BC and it had cup and ring marks on it we think were already on the stone, then it must date to before the standing stone was erected. So we can start to think about these belonging to the Neolithic or the Bronze Age period. And there have been excavations in the last 20 years where radiocarbon dates have been found from features that are next to rock art panels, which we can surmise may have been active features when the rock was being carved. So that could be, for instance, pits with material deposited in it, or fires, or evidence for maybe timber posts being erected and things like that around the rock itself. So taken together, we think it's most likely that these symbols were carved, I would say, in the third millennium BC, maybe around 3000 BC to 2000 BC. The English Heritage timeline is slightly more conservative than that, suggesting anything from the early Neolithic right through to the Middle Bronze Age. But essentially, it's very likely that these symbols are being carved in these periods, the Neolithic, which is the part of the Stone Age where people were farming, and then the Bronze Age, which is where bronze was introduced, essentially. So these are also extremely long periods of time for a tradition to be maintained. And so it may well be that these symbols transcended broader cultural trends and traditions, because right through this broad range of period of time, lots of social change happened in Scotland. or the place we now call Scotland. But cup and ring marks can seem to continue to have been carved and added into new monuments. So maybe these symbols had an enduring long-term significance that sort of seemed to survive the fashions that were washing over people over this really long period of time. And bear in mind also, these are societies that had no written records. So therefore, all of this is being passed on through oral tradition. People copy each other, being shown by elders how to carve these symbols, having things explained to them, and that's how these traditions were maintained. The symbols were probably carved using stones that were harder than stones the symbols were carved into. The evidence for this is quite thin on the ground because the excavations tend to be quite rare at these sites. There's a rather unimpressive collection of rubbish-looking stones that someone's holding in their hand there. It's probably Aaron Watson, which are ones that were found at Coptow that are fit in the hand quite nicely. Most of them, not sure about the one at the end, fit in the hand quite nicely, and I've got evidence for wear at one end. The suggestion being that those are the ones that we used to carve the symbols. And quartz hammer stones were found in Bradley's excavation at Ben Lawers in Ayrshire, and again he argued that these were used to carve the symbols. The symbols themselves were probably created through either a process of pecking or of grinding. And this would have been a process that would have taken quite a long time, depending on the hardness of the rock that you were carving into. But certainly a decent-sized cut mark is probably an hour's work. And that could be accompanied by the kind of repetitive noise of pecking or grinding. And that might have been quite a kind of meditative process. And then the more complicated the symbol, the longer it would have taken to create them. But they were obviously very adept at doing this because the symbols we find have got almost, perfectly circular. So they were very, very good at carving these concentric circles and keeping them the same distance apart. So they obviously were marking things out in advance on the rock and preparing their surface, and perhaps spending days or weeks working on creating these different forms. And the location of these sites in the landscape, which were often in rocky areas that are away from the valley floors, has been used to suggest that these are being carved by people who are in the uplands in the summer with grazing animals, and that people are doing this when there's nothing else to do, because there's nothing else to do in the Neolithic and Bronze Age when you're up in the hills with animals. So obviously this is something that people would do to occupy themselves. The big question, of course, that most people are interested in is what do the symbols actually mean? And this is something that I think is why archaeologists tended to keep away from this area for quite a long time, because most of the theories that were being proposed for, up until the 1970s or 80s were pretty eccentric. These were summarised by Ronald Morris in his book, The Prehistoric Rock Art of Galloway and Isle of Man, where he had a list of, I think it was 104 explanations that he'd read, published in various different books, for what these symbols meant. And these are weird and wonderful. Some of them are potentially quite possible. They may be depictions of maps of landscapes. But, a lot of them are also nonsensical, like stylized sperms and eggs. They didn't have microscopes in pre-history. They didn't know what sperm and eggs looked like, so they could hardly have been drawing them. Where maybe they held eggs, I don't know. Would you really go to the efforts just to have an egg balanced? Maybe they were sacrificing things and the blood was running into the... so there's all sorts of different explanations you can have for this. But ultimately, it's impossible to know what the symbols mean. And I think that once you actually reach that acceptance, then you can move on from getting bogged down. And one of the things that we'll see when we look at Ballochmyle is how much time and effort was expended in just trying to record and measure the symbols and try and make sense of them. And actually, it doesn't really get you anywhere because we don't know, we'll never know. There's no point in trying to think we're ever going to understand what the symbols mean. So instead, maybe we're better to think about why were they being carved? Where are they in the landscape? What was the environment like at the time? Where were people living? What are the types of aspects of these sites that might tell us about the cultural lives of people who lived at this time? And it's also worth noting that not all of these sites are actually prehistoric, or at least they're not cup and ring marks. This is a fantastic site near Balfron. I can't remember the name of the site now, that was explored a few years ago, which is actually a bit of a combination of cup and ring marks, and also it's a quern quarry as well. So this is where rotary querns are being quarried out of this rock face, and it may be there's a bit of a kind of an overlap between the quarrying out of these farming, these pieces of equipment for processing cereal grains, and these earlier symbols being confused together as well. So some of these sites had alternative purposes. So Ballochmyle sits within this context as being a really outstanding example that's actually had relatively little work done other than recording the site. It's been recorded lots and lots of times. That's certainly not the problem. It was, believe it or not, and I couldn't quite believe this when I came to talk about this 6 months ago. It was first discovered in 1986, which is really amazing given the size of the site. And this was during a phase of woodland clearance by the local landowner, and someone from the Catrine, and District Local History Group, Bert Liddell, went in and had a look, and he saw symbols that he thought were probably cup and ring mark symbols, and he then called in archaeologists, and Ronald Morris came down to see the site to confirm that it was definitely a cup and ring mark site. And as I said, Ronald Morris by that time must have been really towards the end of his life, because I think he died in the late 80s. So, but it would have been amazing for him to see this site, given how much effort he'd spent on recording all of the other sites in Scotland over the whole of his part-time rock art career. And when I spoke at Catrine, Bert Liddell was in the audience and kind of told us a bit more about the discovery of the site, which is really an incredible story of, you know, taking a chance, going to see what was there and finding something special. So quite quickly, the archaeological establishment moved in to do some more recording. And so the site was drawn to scale by Ian Scott and Jack Stevenson. So John Stevenson, wrong one. There was two Stevensons at the commission. It was John Stevenson. And Ian Scott is what is probably the foremost a draftsman of recording rock carvings in Scotland. There he is in drawing called Dalton Cross, and his drawings are really stunning. His scale versions of archaeological sites, and he did the definitive drawing of the site, probably over many days of hard work. The site was also photographed extensively, and also probably in 1987 there was a limited excavation carried out of the site as well. And really, what I take this to mean is that they cleared away the debris at the bottom of the cliff face just to see if they could find any more symbols that hadn't been recorded already above the debris line. And I'll show photographs of that in a few minutes. So this initial phase of recording, this is what the site looked like in 1987. It doesn't look like that now because the trees have grown across the whole of the area. So although the rock face is still clear, to get to, you have to climb through a lot of trees. And there's also the river. The river runs past it as well. So it's not hugely easily accessible, but it gives a sense of the scale of the site. Those cliffs there are covered in carvings and symbols, both ancient and modern. And this is the rather modest Ordnance Survey Index card that was logged after Ronald Morris went down and looked at the site in November 1986. And then there's just a recording of John Stevenson's visit in May 1987. And that's how the sites were recorded in the National Monuments Record of Scotland until everything was digitised and turned into Canmore online in the 1990s, and Canmore is about to be turned off, but that's a whole different issue of annoyance for me and many others. So here we have extracts of Ian Scott's drawings, which were published in the Glasgow Archaeological Journal in the late 1980s. And you can get a sense for this of the quality of the work here, because there's the shading, you've got all of the cracks in the rock, and you've also got this real profusion of symbols that have been drawn on by Ian in this drawing. And there's a real kind of density of carvings. You can see in this top image, there's just lots and lots of cup and ring marks that are overlapping each other. So there's many, many phases of carving going on here, and symbols are being added on top of symbols. It's quite chaotic. So there's a real frenzy of activity going on here, which you very rarely find at sites where usually the symbols are more spaced apart. Here, they're really cramming in lots of stuff. And some of these are very unusual symbols as well. Oh, sorry, it was 1993 that the Glasgow Archaeological Journal piece was published. That was the usual rapid pace of archaeologists. It's actually quite quick to publish it within 6 years. And Stevenson wrote an account for the Glasgow Archaeological Journal, and I'll send a PDF of this if anyone wants to read this in more detail, because you can look at the drawings up close in more detail as well. Basically, he just recorded what was found in terms of the locations of the different symbols, and then started to divide up the different types of symbols into what he thought was there. So there was lots and lots of cup and ring marks, and also other symbols that he thought were potentially prehistoric. These things he called ring stars, which are basically kind of star-like shapes with circles around them, which may be prehistoric. They're quite unusual symbols, maybe distinctive to this site. And also some carvings as well of letters and numbers, which are more recent, but he still tried to make sense of those as well. So here, and also we have potential red deer as well, or maybe chickens, I'm not sure which. So I've got these, what Stevenson called rather poorly executed Ballochmyle examples of deer, which he argues could be prehistoric or could be medieval or later. The discovery of the Duncraig deer makes it more likely these could be prehistoric, so it certainly there are parallels. The other thing that was identified was a series of letters, which Stevenson suggested was of a Lombardic script, which is a medieval period. But it wasn't really clear what it meant or what it was saying. There's a sort of sense that it might say ASAID, but it's not very clear. And also the year 1751 has been added. That's not to say that that was added in 1751, which is what was assumed at the time, but it may well be that someone did indeed come along here in 1751 and carve the year on to the rock. Who knows? So there's a lot of stuff going on in this rock. It's complicated. Here's just some more photographs that I've from online, which just show again some of the really distinctive characteristics. So we've got this, for instance, on the top right, there's a whole series of cut marks with gutters running out of them and running vertically down the rock face, which potentially are again aligning with the water flow down the face of the rock. There's also the bottom left is quite different to see, but here, running along here, there's a line of cut marks, which is incredibly unusual, and there's a few of these kind of horizontal lines of cut marks on the rock, which potentially are augmenting or mimicking natural cracks on the rock. And then there's also lots of overlapping cup and ring marks as well, and that's one of the deer in the top left that someone's photographed. And here's a photograph of the excavation, which I think probably happened in spring 1987. There's no documentation whatsoever of this happening, other than a few photographs that are held in the National Monetary Record of Scotland. There was never any report written about this. I don't think John Stevens is still alive anymore to ask him what happened here. So, but as I say, what I think happened is just cleared away the debris at the bottom of the cliff just to see what was happening. But what they didn't do was they didn't really investigate the surface at the bottom of the cliff to look for cut features or anything that could be associated with the carving, which is what we would do now in excavations. So I think there's potential to go back there and do some additional excavation work along the bottom of the cliff face to see whether anyone was digging pits in here or there's any evidence for burning or other activity or deposition going on at this site. So I think there's potential to go back and do some more excavation work. So the site, as I mentioned, has been recorded again and again since this initial discovery and this flurry of information. So for instance, AOC Archaeology, a commercial unit, carried out a laser scanning and photogrammetry survey in 2015, and they created this 3D model, which they then laid on top of Ian Scott's drawings, which you've got an extract of here. And again, you can see there's lots of different symbols here. This work was commissioned by Forest Land Scotland. Here we've got another visualization of the rock surface. This is available online, based on the same material. And you can find this in the SCARF website, which is the Scotland's Archaeological Research Framework, where there's a document looking at carved stones in Scotland, and this is one of the case studies. And again, this is just adding a different type of colour and light to try and pick out the different symbols and see what they look like. And a lot of this work was interpreting the site just to try and find more symbols. So this is a more interpreted piece of work that AOC did, where they started to pick out different types of symbols on the surface of the rock. So in the top left, there's lots of cup marks and cup and ring marks. The one on the right, they've picked out these lines of cup marks that I talked about earlier on. And they've also got in the bottom left these things that they call the green things, which are slash-like motifs, which are really the cup marks with gutters running out of them, which are sort of dribbling down the side of the rock. And then the possible deer in orange and some other shapes and yellow as well, like a strawberry type thing. So all of this is really trying to record and document the site. None of this is telling us what the site was used for, when it was used, or anything about the people that carved the symbols. All it's doing is just recording the same thing again and again in different ways, which is a bit of a trap that archaeologists often get themselves into. As I mentioned, Scotland's rock art project came along in the last 5 years. They recorded more or less every rock art site in Scotland they could. They didn't do any more work at the main Ballochmyle panel, but they did do a bit of laser scanning at what they called the Muffy-Scotty panel, which is one where there's this rather dramatic bit of modern graffiti, where it says Muff and Scotty. And they actually identified some previously unrecorded rock art symbols in amongst this graffiti, which had probably been missed by archaeologists earlier on who didn't really consider this as being an important part of the panel. So it may well be that there are other symbols still undiscovered along this cliff face that may be obscured by more recent acts of vandalism and graffiti, but they didn't do any more work on the site in itself. There's also other carvings on the rock as well, which are not necessarily related to prehistory, but nonetheless, we would now record, perhaps as, for instance, historic graffiti, as we might call it. So these were photographs recorded by Gavin McGregor, who's now the Director of Archaeology Scotland, and he wrote a blog post about the site a few years ago, where he went and had a look around and crawled around this cliff face, and he found this kind of large bit of text that had been added to the site at some point, and also these linear features on the left image, which potentially could be what we call polissoirs, which are where axes were being sharpened in the Neolithic periods. They used to use stones, and then they would rub polished stone axes on the stones to polish them. And polissoirs have been found in close proximity to rock art sites that were found in the island of Bute as part of Scotland's rock art project. So there may also have been other prehistoric activity going on here as well, which Gavin picked up on. And there's also a good deal of graffiti and vandalism as well. Stevenson and his gauge paper documents that people have been coming along and chipping symbols off and taking them away once the site had first been found. And there's lots of other graffiti as well. Led Zeppelin is, you know, we can say that is not pre-Led Zeppelin, that graffiti, so we can put a bit of a date on that. Some people have painted some of the symbols or coloured them in, and there's all the other graffiti and things on the site as well. So there's all sorts of stuff happened on the site. It's got this kind of very kind of rich biography of engagement, which actually in some cases only goes back to 1986. So it's almost a living rock. People are still, for good or for ill, leaving their mark on this stone. So all that recording's been done, but what else can we say about this site in terms of what it tells us about how this site was being used? One theory that was developed by Richard Bradley, who's one of the leading prehistorians in British archaeology, he argued that he thought that the significance of Ballochmyle was that the vertical rock face was specifically chosen because this rock face was illuminated by the midsummer sunset, sorry, the wrong way around, and it was pitched towards the sun. And he called this like almost like a solar panel, which sort of soaked up the sun's energy, and it was connected with solstice events, and it may have been a place of ritual and ceremony. And it's actually quite unusual to find rock art sites that you can connect this closely to solstice events, even though there have been attempts to try and argue that some of them are aligned with solstice events. But the verticality of this site means it has a direction, which is quite unusual for rock art sites. And so it may well be that it was a site of significance in relation to the solstices, which we know were important to people in prehistory. I think there's also something interesting about the vertical nature of this site and the way that people would have engaged with this rock art, which would have been unique really amongst all of these types of sites. Because I think that most sites, people would have had to be on their knees or on the ground, carving things onto slopes or boulders. This is one place where people could stand comfortably and carve. And it may explain why there's so many symbols on this stone, because it was so easy for people to stand and to carve these symbols. So we have to think about the way that people organise themselves bodily in relation to this site. They may have had a very different relationship with this rock than other carved stones. It's also on the river, the water here, the river here, more likely, which has got a coastal connection. So it may be the association with the river may be important as well, but may again have been a site of where perhaps there's deposition going on in the water, It may have been accessible from the coast, by people arriving in the coastline. So that connection, both inland and to the sea, may have been made by this site as well. And it also fits in with a kind of broader monumental landscapes, as we'll see, of this part of Western Scotland, where there are actually quite a lot of Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments and sites which are relatively little known, but there's lots of stuff there if you kind of care to look. There's some of the symbols, I already showed a symbol, look very similar to this Newgrange carving. Some of the symbols have got these kind of almost overlapping cup and ring marks that almost like spirals. So it might also be a connection to Ireland as well, with the passage grave art tradition, which does also have examples in places like Anglesey and Orkney. So it's possible that travellers may have come to this site from different cultural traditions and may have added their symbols to the site as well. And we can never rule out anywhere in southwest Scotland having strong connections with Ireland in prehistory. Now, I mentioned already, the thing that's really strange about Ballochmyle is how few other rock art sites are in this area. This map is not, it's not a huge area it's covering here. But to make the point that in this screen grab from the Scotland's Rock Art Project website, there are only 3 sites they have on their record that have any kind of cup and ring marks on them, Ballochmyle being one. The other 2, as far as I can tell, there's basically nothing there. There doesn't seem to be anything really convincing. I think they're just natural features that maybe once have been thought to be cup marks. So this is a real blank spot in the map, and I think that's real because archaeologists and others have crawled over this area for centuries and haven't found any other sites. But as I said, there's lots of other stuff going on in this area, and what we've got is an area that must have been an incredibly good place to live in the 3rd millennium BC. Lots of very high quality farming land, as there is today, or it always would have been the same in prehistory. Places that had got strong coastal connections to Arran, to the Firth of Clyde, to Ireland as well. A very well connected place, in other words, and also you're not far from routeways that take you right into the heart of central Scotland. So probably lots of people are moving through this area in prehistory. And there's also lots of other things going on that were very likely contemporary to rock art. So we've got, for instance, a dry bridge, which is a bit closer to the coast. There's a Neolithic Cursus monument, which is a massive earthwork enclosure, which is about 800 metres long, and it runs up to the River Irvine. And there's 1 or 2 henge monuments by that, which are probably late Neolithic or early Bronze Age ceremonial enclosures. There's examples of potential domestic sites at Dreghorn near Kilmarnock, and there's tons of stuff at Shilton Moss as well. Lots of things going on throughout prehistory. So there's lots of things happening in this area, and these are the people who are carving the symbols, who are living in these kind of small farms in the lowland area with the high quality land, and then perhaps taking their animals to graze in slightly kind of less busy bits of the landscape. But because archaeologists who ignored rock art for a long time have ignored Ayrshire, sorry to say, you probably realise that, then we've actually got this kind of very patchy picture of what was probably a very densely occupied, busy area in the Neolithic and Bronze Age. But that hasn't really quite been picked apart by archaeologists yet. And I think Ballochmyle suggests that there's something really important happening here that archaeologists are missing out on. So I just want to finish now just looking at one other example of a project I've been involved in Western Bartonshire, a place called Faithley, which is just the northern edge of Clyde Bank, basically. And this is really just to show what can be possible when a community archaeology project really becomes quite successful. And it actually can take sites which are spectacular but obscure, and really interesting things can happen. So this is in particular the site I'm interested in, as I mentioned already, is the Cochno Stone. So this is a drawing of the Cochno Stone from 1895 by William Donnelly, and this was in the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquities of Scotland. And it doesn't really do justice to the size of this stone. It's huge. It's about 16 metres by 8 metres in total. So it's about 100 square metres on its surface, and it's a massive hog-backed sort of sandstone block. And it's covered in over 100 cup and ring mark symbols. And it's also got, as we'll see, a huge quantity of modern graffiti. So there are very close parallels to Ballochmyle, a densely carved, extremely interesting site with really lots of stuff going on in prehistory, but also a kind of this modern story of graffiti and damage to the site as well. The Cochno Stone is in a more extreme version. This is the Cochno Stone in 1937. during a visit of the Glasgow Archaeological Society, kilts and all. And one thing that might strike you, first of all, you can see how big the Cocknell stone is. This is taken from one end of the site, looking along. It's an absolutely massive big stone with a hog-backed top. The thing that's really maybe noticeable, though, you might spot, is the fact that it seems to be weirdly coloured and have lines on it. And this is because the antiquarian Ludwig Mann, who I think that might be Ludwig Mann standing just about there, giving a lecture about the site, because he organised this field trip. Ludwig Mann decided to paint the whole of the surface of the Cocknell stone using oil paints in 1937. He painted all of the prehistoric symbols green and white, and he added a grid in 3 other different colours, which runs around the site almost like a latitude-longitude. And he argued that this depicted a whole range of different aspects of the story of what the symbols meant, which was completely mad. His theories were really eccentric, to say the least. And also, this is a monument that is completely covered in oil paint, and the oil paint is still on the site now, even today, in places that have been buried and haven't been exposed to the elements. So this set in train a motion where everyone who visited the Cocknell stone over the next 30 years, well, not everyone, but lots of people visited the Cocknell stone, carved their name onto the stone, carved their initials onto it. So by the mid-1960s, you had this monument where there was lots of people living nearby, people were going up to the stone, they were having picnics on it, they were carving their initials onto it, when usually children breaking their penknives. As they've told me, I've interviewed pensioners who were guilty, and they told me all about it. And the site was just covered in all sorts of stuff. And so 1965 was buried by the Ministry of Works to stop this happening. And the site was completely covered under up to a metre of soil. So the story of this site was completely shut off in 1965, 21 years before Ballochmyle was even found. So about 10 years ago, I worked with a digital heritage company to uncover the Cocknell stone for 2 weeks. And we were able to do photogrammetry, 3D recording, laser recording, so we could create a 3D model of the site, and that's just some photographs during the excavation. We didn't actually scrape the stone with the digger. The digger had to stop at a certain point, and then we had to use plastic and rubber tools, which was a bit of a slow job. This ended up with a production of a 3D model, which you can look at online, which shows all of the symbols, including all of the cup and ring marks, which are very similar to the Ballochmyle symbols, but also all the graffitis there as well for you to look at if you want as well. But this created a huge amount of local enthusiasm and interest. And so people started to send photographs to me of them enjoying the stone. So there's a lady there on her wedding day. There's local people who used to go up there on their wedding day as a kind of good luck fertility thing. The site was known locally as a Druid stone. So it's good to know you're not as strange as people from Western Bartonshire down here. You've got all these other people on the site. This photograph here in the bottom left has got these 2 chaps are called Smith and Cairns, and we found their names carved onto the stone next to each other as well. So that may have been the visit that they carved their names onto the stone. So there's a lot of local archive, and people were interested in the story of the site, and also about trying to reflect on what it meant as burial and what could be done with it in the future. There's other sites in the area as well, so there are more sites here. So there's about 12 rock art sites in the broader landscape. And so we had a campaign over a few years, which was slightly scuppered by the pandemic, of excavation and survey of these other sites as well, involving the local community. So Scotland's Rock Art Project carried out a 3D survey of all of the sites in March 2019. And the team there included students from Glasgow and also community members as well. One or two people were able to show us cup and ring mark sites that had never been recorded by archaeologists before, but they played on them when they were children. So we got this amazing local knowledge. And then also I carried out some excavations around some of the other sites as well. So the Cocknell stone was just cleared, and then we covered it back over again because it's a scheduled ancient monument. But we were able to do these other excavations of other rock art panels. This one, Achna Craig 1 and 2, 3, sorry, were both in a lovely house that was built in 1911 that had a really wonderful, perfect lawn. When Ronald Morris recorded these sites in the 1960s, he photographed them next to this beautifully kept lawn. In the 1970s or 80s, the house fell into ruination and burnt down, and now it's just an overgrown, scrubby part of the park. But the excavation showed that the rock art became a garden feature for the people who lived in this house, and they actually had a little entranceway to allow them to walk up on top of the rock art. And they also children were playing marble games on the stones as well. We found marbles in the excavation. We also found marbles at the Cockno stone, and that was because children were playing games trying to get marbles to stay in the cup and ringmarks. Impossible at Ballochmyle, it has to be said. So this gradually became a bit of a broader campaign involving a lot of local organisations. So the Faithfully Community Council became involved, the Nows Housing Association, which is where most of the residents of Faithfully live in their properties, and the local MSP was incredibly supportive, and we're able to carry out a whole range of different events. So we had excavations, we had open days, we had workshops. I did a lot of talks locally, so there's a lot of momentum built up around the Coffin Stone and the rock art in Faithfully. And we did a lot of community engagement and work with the community to try and ask them what they wanted the future of the site to be. And some people wanted the stone be uncovered again, the Coffin Stone. Other people were more determined that it was to be left protected, and then maybe a replica could be added in or something like that in the future. This kind of culminated in a parliamentary event in the Scottish Parliament in 2020, where lots of people came over from Faithfully, and there was a reception to talk about the rock art and its future, and the potential social benefit of rock art in Scotland. And then the pandemic happened a month later, and the momentum sort of was lost really in terms of that broader aim, although we're starting to get back to doing things now again. But the one thing that's really been rewarding is working with local children. So I've done a lot of work with kids over the last 10 years, whether that be doing talks, doing kind of workshop, pop-up labs where they record the rock art and photograph it. Then we do full-size coffin stones in chalk on pavements. That will be an amazing thing to do in schools around here with the Ballochmyle, doing a one-to-one scale Ballochmyle and get the children to chalk in the symbols onto the stone. We had a comic book made up and all sorts of different things. And one of the outcomes of all of this work was that last year, it was announced that a new school campus was being built in Faithfully, and the campus was going to be inspired by the Cockno Stone. So believe it or not, the school is going to be the same colour as the Cockno Stone, and there's going to be cup and ring mark symbols all through the design of the building, including huge symbols on the outside of the stone. The idea being basically that this rock art is part of the heritage of Faithfully, and that they want the children who are growing up there to understand that and see that. And that's been reinforced by an educational charity who have been doing workshops with the kids before their two campuses are merged this summer, getting the kids together from different both schools to reflect on this idea. This is something I said at the parliamentary event, that the place that you live has been special for thousands of years. And Faithfully is somewhere that lots of people tell people from Faithfully, that's a horrible place, it's a terrible place. And this has given the kids something to be proud about. And you're starting from a better level, because everyone loves Cumnock already. Everyone loves this area of Scotland, Mauchline, Catrine. So you don't have to worry about that so much. But the place that you live has also been special for thousands of years. And I think that's something that could maybe motivate some more work to be done archaeologically, community work with Ballochmyle, because that's a really special site. And everyone here should know that you've got one of the best rock art sites in Europe on your doorstep that's there for everyone to enjoy. And that's something that I hope you'll do a bit more in the future. So I'll finish at that point. I'm happy to answer any questions. And thanks very much for listening and coming along this evening. Thank you.
Well, that was fascinating. I think everybody enjoyed that. Has anybody got any questions for Kenny?
Just to take up your very final point there, Kenny. I've visited the Coffin Rings many, many times since I was covered in the 80s.
Yes.
And it's just almost a 5-minute detour from what's known as the River Airway, which runs all the way from Glenbock to here.
Yeah.
But Cumnock History Group were due to visit it a few weeks ago, and I sort of went to see what the conditions are like. It's very, very hard to access it at the moment.
Yes. Yeah.
There are sugly fences,
Yes.
there are trees fallen, and all the rest of it.
Mm.
But in your opinion, do you think it would be worthwhile making it almost a tourist site, getting all that cleared as part of the River Airway, and get people to enjoy it and see it? Or is the possibility that you're going to have, as you saw there with
Yeah.
Huff and Scotty,
Yeah, yeah.
you're going to get graffiti artists
Yeah.
making a mess of it?
I think that it would be a very good thing to do to make it more accessible. I think, you know, that you could, if you could have a path that goes down
It's
and you
very
have like
dangerous.
yeah, exactly, you know, there's like you have to climb over a fence and things, and it's not accessible really for a lot of people. If you could make it, the site have a safe access to it, I don't think you'd be overcome with so many visitors it would be a problem. There's always the potential of graffiti and vandalism, but there's that potential for any archaeological site. I mean, you know, every year people carve their initials onto the standing stones at Matty Moor, which is a kind of internationally well-known site. So that potentially might happen. But I think also the more people that that know about a site locally, the more likely it is that the site will be looked after. So for instance, Archaeology Scotland have got an adopt a monument scheme where you can adopt a monument, not literally, but you have a group who are will maybe tidy the site up, keep an eye on it, maybe provide information for visitors, make it more accessible, and then almost kind of not quite police the site, but have a bit more of a presence and make it clear that it's a site that people are looking after and responsible for. And part of that could be, you know, if it's easy to make it part of an existing walking trail, that's perfect. So I think that obviously would have to be some investment to make the site safely accessible, but I think it's worth doing because it's such a spectacular site. You've been there lots of times. It's incredible. There's nothing else like it. You know, it's really an amazing site. So I think it's worth it.
Photograph we showed there of graffiti, not
Yes.
the mock one,
Yes.
is memorial to a private Brown who died in the First World War in the Battle of Cambrai. And that to me is absolutely fabulous graffiti.
Yeah.
It means something
That's
other than just daubing a wall with paint and all of that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But what also surprises me was it took until the 1980s to discover the copping links.
Well, yeah.
Whereas in 1848, about a few yards along the road, a few yards along the path, was one of the most fantastic pieces of masonry ever built in the world, and that's the Ballochmyle Viaduct. Why was it not discovered then? I find it hard to believe that they never came across it.
I'd be amazed if local people didn't know about it, people hadn't come across it. I mean, and for whatever reason, no one ever decided to speak to an archaeologist, or people didn't know what it was, or there must have been people who knew about it. It must have been known. There maybe are people who've got photographs and things like that. So yeah, it must have been known. And yeah, when you're building a viaduct, they must have. So people must. So, but back in the 1840s, no one knew what these things were at all. I mean, they only were recorded archaeologically in the 1880s or 1890s. So, but you know, I'm sure people locally must have known about it. So maybe I should get something in the local media or local press and try and find out. But I'm sure that people were down there playing when they were children, or someone would have definitely seen it.
And probably really understood.
Yeah.
It's not that, because the stuff.
Yeah, no, yeah, no, we now know that it's very important and it's very old. Yes. Yeah. No. But that's yeah. Yeah, well, it could have been absolutely, and I think the exciting potential of Ballochmyle is that there is potential to do excavation there and maybe find something out useful, which has been done at other rock art sites in northern Britain, and it could work at Ballochmyle. So, and you could, because there's a big area at the base, you could find things that could give you radiocarbon dates and other things related to it. So I think there's actually huge potential to answer some of those questions at Ballochmyle that you don't have at other sites, because other sites are more exposed or disturbed, or they're just not got the same potential. So, you know, some of those questions could be asked with a nicely placed trench, I would say.
Who's the landowner, can we go?
But the East Ayrshire Line Countryside Services would know, because we have to look after them anyway. So they have to do, they don't do.
Yeah, I can't remember the, I can't remember the name, yeah, the name of the landowner in the 80s who did the woodland clearance. I don't know if it's the same company, it was a estate, I think.
Well, if it is first, it might be. It's got Oscars in it.
Yeah, but that's something that we use worth finding out.
Yeah.
Who actually owns it. Because that would be an issue about access, for
Yeah.
instance. Possibly, it's possible because that is a very soft sandstone. You can see how easily people have left marks in it. So if that was exposed to the elements and not protected in a sheltered valley with trees, then it could be that it could be really badly eroded. So then there may have been other sites that there's just nothing left anymore. I don't really know the geology enough to know where other big sandstone outcrops might be, maybe further along the river valley, but it's definitely possible that sites are exposed, and it was exacerbated by acid rain, which made things decay more quickly, and modern pollution, which is gradually damaging sites. And one of the reasons the Cocknell stone still looks so good is because it's been buried since 1965, for good or for ill. So that the last 50 years have been especially harsh on rock art sites. So there could well have been more that have just gone, just disappeared and eroded away.
When staff went to do the recording, they didn't go and look round the other sort of sections,
Yeah.
because there's lots more big rock
Yeah.
faces around
I think
there.
there's lots more to be
Yeah.
found by just actually
Yeah,
just going there and actually spending time looking at all of it, and maybe clearing a little bit of vegetation away here and there and things like that. Yeah, big potential. Well, they might have coloured rock art. I mean, there's been a bit of research in the last few years done by a couple of researchers trying to work out whether they actually did use pigments and colour in rock art, and it's possible that some of them may have been, but it's difficult to pick up the traces chemically because of weathering and erosion. But it's the same person that Louisa, my colleague, who did analysis of the Antonine wall distance slabs and found that they were all painted bright colours. Now they're just brown stones now, but the Romans painted them red and white and garish colours to frighten the locals. But that you wouldn't know that now to look at them, but that can be picked up chemically. So the Ballochmyle is a site where it would be really interesting. Well, no, I didn't know. I mean, they couldn't frighten the Romans couldn't frighten Scottish people. Not that they were Scottish people, but so Ballochmyle is another place I thought where we could get down there with the right recording equipment. It's a portable XRF, it's called. I don't know what XRF stands for, but it was portable, and you can use that to do analysis, and it may well be the site, because of where the site is and that there's been a lack of erosion, that you could pick up potential for prehistoric colouring in of the symbols, not the modern graffiti, which is obviously already present. So again, there's potential for that as well, for research to be done here too.
where do we start? One day.
Yeah, well, that's the issue. Yeah, I mean, some of this stuff you can do for free, but yeah, inevitably there's some funding. But I'd be very happy to advise and help, because it's a really stunning site. I mean, I can do excavations very cheaply, but other stuff like access and more scientific recording it requires resources. But I've got a lot of students who are looking for excavation experience, so
Yes.
so and actually excavation is very cheap as long as you don't find anything. That's just, you start finding things, that's where the problems start.
Lots of food for thought there. So, looks like our funds quite. What's for sale the book? Yeah. Will be quids in, yeah. Yeah, it's been really inspirational, I think. And we should be proud of having such a
Absolutely, yeah.
facility or a work of art on our doorstep. Any other questions? Or feel free to come and chat to Kenny before he goes. Can I call on Kevin to do the facts?
It's on the other, it's on the closer to Faithfully, it's on the south side of Cocknell Road. So there's not any rock art on the vet school's land. But there's other prehistoric stuff further up the hill as well. But yeah, it's the other side of Cocknell Road, which is a road that runs up to the vet school. So we have used that as a base to store our tools and things like that, you know, when we're working up there. So yes, the university owns a farm at Cocknell as it happens, it's quite coincidentally. And a few years ago, the university started making its own wool or its own yarn for knitting, and using sheep that are on the Cocknell farm. And so the symbol, one of the rock art symbols in the Cocknell stone was used on the packaging for the wool. It's nice. Yeah, I've heard stories I've heard about that place. There's all the people in Faithfully have all said to me that is it true about the radioactive gorilla they buried up there? So I don't know what. So all the local people have heard all these weird rumours about dead dogs and animals and burials and stuff like that. So I think because it's an experimental vet school, then I think in the past they probably did more experimentation on animals than we would do now. They were going, yes, yeah, but I think they're going to now turn it into, I think they want to just turn it into lots of solar panels. That seems to be the future for much of Cocknell Farm, unfortunately. Well, much of the Ballochmyle being a solar panel, according to Bishop Bid.
Okay, that was I was just a citizen very much to the to actually draft something like that. It's interesting when it's really
Yeah.
the actual data set it's the same message as it's got
No, it's not.
especially
Yeah, exactly.
and especially using also lots of it.
Yeah.
And the thing is, fascinates is it really useful. If you actually
Yeah.
it.
No, you're right. Yeah.
I think it's partly fixed the experience just like we still do it, you can still find you pay, you still do it.
Yeah.
I just a little bit too late for the price game. I mean, you see ratings, different things like that, as long as things that were maybe that's just we can leave that but get the attention here.
Yes.
I think it's well, we'll probably make looking at suddenly very scared right next to that you go up and start to use them.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
The best. It's a big thing. That's it is no state. That's the end of stuff. Absolutely. And this last over to
Thank you very much. Yeah.
It's not as a battery slot, it's something else.